Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Tomford-Hauser from the Center for Court Innovation, and I'm really excited to be here with you today to be talking about holistic responses to abusive partner intervention. This project was supported by the Office on Violence Against Women. We received a grant to provide training and technical assistance to jurisdictions around the country to enhance their responses to abusive partner intervention and engagement. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move through this presentation. Today, our learning objectives are to describe the history and context of abusive partner intervention programs. We'll define relational accountability. We'll describe our guiding principles that we created as part of our National Training and Technical Assistance Project. We'll work together to identify innovative research-informed national practices to engage abusive partners, and we'll talk with some national experts about how those practices are implemented and how we can apply those guiding principles and best practices to individual civil and criminal court policies and practices. So I want to just talk to you a little bit about the Center for Court Innovation before I introduce my colleagues and partners who are going to be with us today. So the Center for Court Innovation is located in New York City. We are an organization whose mission is to create a more just and humane legal system. And we do that in a few different ways. We have a research team that is identifying ways in which to help us understand how the justice system is and isn't working, and reporting on some of the projects that we've been running. We have operating programs throughout the city of New York where we work hand in hand with the court system there to develop innovative ways to make the justice system more accessible to litigants. And then we have a team of expert consultants, or our training and technical assistance team. I work on our gender and family justice team, and we work with jurisdictions around the country to help enhance their response to domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And we do that through site visits, strategic planning, working with communities to identify their strengths and needs. We can do targeted training around substantive issues, and then we help jurisdictions understand ways that they can measure their success or evaluate the processes and policies that they've created. Let me advance our slide here. Today we'll be talking about our abusive partner intervention and engagement project that is funded, as I said, by the Office on Violence Against Women. We're really excited about this grant funding stream. We have an amazing group of national expert consultants. One of our partners is Futures Without Violence, and then, as I said, we have partners, consultants from around the country, two of whom will be with us today, Cheryl Davis and Jim Henderson, and I'll let them introduce themselves to you in a few minutes. Together with these consultants, we developed guiding principles that we will walk through today with you. And we've worked with jurisdictions around the country to do training around those guiding principles, to highlight practices that our consultants are doing in their community that we feel are in line with our guiding principles. And so we're really excited to be working with them in this project. So I wanted to give our consultants time to introduce themselves. Today, two of them are with us, Jim Henderson and Cheryl Davis. So Cheryl, can you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I've been working in the domestic violence field for about 25 years. I first started working in victim services, and then also moved into what's sometimes known as batter intervention programming. And then at the end of my working career, because I'm currently retired and do consulting with Center for Court Innovation, I worked for the state of Colorado for about 15 years. Colorado has a state domestic violence offender management board that sets the standards for domestic violence offender treatment in that state. And so I was very involved in policy and working with different communities all around the state.
Great, thanks, Cheryl. Jim, do you want to talk to us a little bit about who you are?
Sure, thank you for having me, everyone. My name is Jim Henderson. I am an adult child exposed to domestic violence and grew up in a home when violence was happening. I was lucky enough to work underneath the Honorable Judge Hines and Honorable Ann Matson in Ann Arbor, Michigan, running a domestic violence stalking court from the end of the 1990s through 2010. I also run a batterers intervention program here in Wayne County, Michigan. That would be the county that incorporates Detroit. So a very diverse community as far as ethnicity and wealth and education. So I appreciate being here and working with you and talking with you today.
Great, thanks so much. So we're going to be spending a lot of time today talking about accountability. And so I wanted to have Jim start us off and talk a little bit about Barbara Hart and how she started thinking about accountability for people who cause harm in intimate partner relationships, abusive partners. Some people still refer to them as batterers. So Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about what this definition is and why we use this when we're framing our discussion around accountability?
Absolutely, because initially when we started looking at what accountability was from a criminal justice system, it was really about arresting, prosecuting, incarcerating, and maybe sending people to a program, that was very rigid and structured. And we didn't think about how all of our policies and procedures impacted those who were being harmed. So it was pioneers in the movement, such as Barbara Hart, Ellen Pence, and a variety of women who said, hold on, if accountability of the perpetrator results in more harm to the people they're victimizing and in their home, we've accomplished nothing. That's not our goal. That the number one priority had to be everything we did to hold this person accountable made life safer for those in the community and those they were harming. They also wanted us to make sure that when we're working with those who cause harm, that we're able to help them understand the impact of their coercive controlling behavior on those they're harming back at their home. Both the identified victim, who may be the person who I physically or verbally or emotionally assaulted, but also the other people who live in the home, my children, the auntie who lives with us, the mother-in-law, my community, and elsewhere. And then she wanted us to really look at how do we make reparations for that behavior? How do we pay restitution, right? To people that we've harmed. Some of these relationships are ending, and I may have destroyed my partner's opportunity to be gainfully employed, destroyed their credit, destroyed their reputation. What could I, as a person who caused harm, do to modify and change that behavior, make amends, and be held accountable for that? So it's really a different focus. Yes, we're working with the perpetrator, but always with the lens on of realizing how's my actions and inactions, how's our policies and procedures impact those who are being harmed, and making sure that that's our number one priority over offender behavior change or over and beyond accountability.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's so helpful in the framing. I also think that another layer of accountability comes when we're talking about how the court and the legal system defines accountability and responsibility. They have their own definitions of who is a victim. They have another definition of who is responsible for that behavior. And that depends if you're coming in on a criminal case. It's not domestic violence unless it's legally defined as a crime, right? And then there is some kind of legal maybe a restitution that needs to be made or some kind of accountability for that person if they're proven guilty. when we're coming in on the civil side and thinking about domestic violence, often we're thinking about something that's driven by that survivor. They're coming into court to actively ask for a civil protective order against somebody, and they're driving that process. When we're thinking about, and sometimes in those civil contexts, we can be talking about custody, visitation, parenting, divorce proceedings, right? And so judges are going to be thinking about responsibility in a larger sense of things. And then child protective cases, they're really often looking at the child in these cases as the victim, and really thinking about responsibility and accountability for both parents, regardless of whether that mother or one of those parents is the victim as well as some kind of domestic violence or abuse. So I think when we're thinking about accountability, we're thinking, as you said, about that personal accountability. We're starting to think a little bit about that coordinated community response, and then needing to understand that the court may have their own ideas and definitions of accountability as defined by their family laws and their criminal laws.
You know, can I say something, Rebecca?
Yeah, sure.
What I really like when you're talking about civil, because for the many women who are in the most dangerous situations, they may be very scared to use the criminal justice system. And now when looking at systematic oppression and stuff like that, different groups may not really feel trusting to engage in calling the police and bringing in criminal courts. So Detroit's done a really good job, I think, in the family court of finding men who cause harm. And we have some women who've been in really dangerous situations. I mean, we're talking about strangled, threatened to have the baby beaten out of them. And then it comes to court either through divorce or child custody, all those things that you said, where a judge has mandated as a condition that that person who's causing harm complete a batterers intervention program, maybe have supervised visitation through a visitation center, be involved in growth works. But it's really been impactful for families and giving families another avenue to find safety, find some justice. And so I'm really happy to see some civil courts around the country starting to step up to the plate and not forcing victims to use a criminal justice system, which they may not feel will be aiding them the best way.
Right. Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit later about some ways in which civil courts and family courts are using programming as a way to engage behavior change and encourage behavior change with that person who's caused harm or that abusive partner. Cheryl, I wanted to just turn it over to you and think about, have you talk a little bit about ways in which courts are often thinking about, you know, what their focus is when they're thinking about accountability as well, from your perspective.
Sure. I think one of the things that we tend to really focus on is reducing recidivism. And I think often from the court standpoint, and I've heard judges say and other court administrators, we don't want to keep seeing the same people coming back through the system. And how do we find something that's really going to work and be effective? So certainly one of the things that we need to look at is recidivism, but we also really need to look at risk factors and really acknowledge that all of these people who are abusive, they're not all the same when we look at their risk. And in Colorado, what we have done is look at the research on what reduces recidivism, again, going back to that point, because that is important. And we have found some really great studies that show how we reduce recidivism for the general criminal population, and then looking at the domestic violence population, those who have offended, to see if they specialize in domestic violence crimes, and they really don't. And if you're working in the court system, you're probably pretty aware of that, because you're seeing folks come through the system, and sometimes they may have only that domestic violence charge, but often there's some other areas. So in Colorado, we have really incorporated looking at assessing risk and how do we reduce recidivism. There's a whole training on that that's available on the Center for Court Innovation website, so I'm not going to spend more time on that now. But as we came together as partners with CCI on this project that we're talking about today, we all came together and realized that there really is a lot more to accountability than just looking at reducing recidivism. And so one of the things that we did was we realized that we needed to create a definition of what does accountability need to include. And you can see that on your screen, talking about creating relational pathways to responsibility and healing. And there really is so much more to accountability. We might think very preliminarily in terms of, is this abusive partner attending group if he's been required to do that? Is he paying his fees? Has he gotten any new arrests? But there's really, as a group, we all came together and determined there's really so much more that we need to be looking at than that. And again, what other responsibilities do they have? And also referring back to Barbara Hart and others and what we learned from them, that part of accountability is, how is this person responding to their family? Are they taking responsibility for contributing financially and some other areas like that?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think one of the things that we have been thinking about as we met together with that team of consultants and national experts is this expanded definition of accountability. And one of the things that we were thinking about in doing that was, what is the role of abusive partner intervention programs? Many of you may refer to them or have batter intervention programs, family violence intervention programs, domestic violence education programs. We've been calling them abusive partner intervention programs, or APIPs. So when we came together, we were thinking about, okay, what is the role of APIPs in accountability? Because when you think about Barbara Hart and that concept of a coordinated community response, the programs are really just one part of that accountability. The court is going to be working on accountability within the confines or within the statutes available to them. And so oftentimes courts are referring men or mandating men to programs. And we're going to be gendered here for a few reasons. One, we know the statistics validate and support a gendered review of domestic violence, and the fact that more men are committing these crimes against their female intimate partners in heterosexual relationships. We will be talking later. One of our principles is around culture and community, and so we'll be talking about intersectionality a little bit later. But when we're talking about the role of programs, these programs were initially created for men who are using violence against their female intimate partners. So I didn't want us to forget to mention that important component and the language that we're using. So when we're thinking about how these programs were created, back in the early 70s, when there was this lack of a criminal response to domestic violence, we're talking about Ellen Pence and Barbara Hart thinking about these things in northern Minnesota. They thought about, this idea of a coordinated community response, where programs were really one prong of that response, where victim advocates and probation and courts and prosecutors and defense bar, other types of programming, all needed to come together. Since those times when it was really created as a tool of accountability for a court or a criminal response, there are more than 2,000 programs. So back over 10 years ago now, our office did a study where we were looking at domestic violence courts around the country, and we were also looking at programs around the country. And at that point, there were over 2,000. So it's really hard to measure how many there are. Not every state has standards. Not every state is has a list of a program per se. We know that many programs are required by statute for certain DV offenses. So maybe in your jurisdiction, your court and your judges are required to mandate someone to a program if they are found guilty of X, Y, and Z crime. On your civil side, judges may be able to, as part of a civil protective order, some of those conditions, they may be able to mandate someone to complete a program. Also, as part of a family court resolution around supervised visitation, sometimes judges will say, if you complete this program and you go to supervised visitation, then we'll think about unsupervised visits, right? There's a lot of different ways. Child protective services may include in their treatment plan a mandate that the offending parent needs to go to some kind of programming. And we know that about 80% of participants are court ordered. When we are thinking about this expanded definition of accountability, we want to really be thinking about community and community response that is not attached necessarily to a criminal response. Are there programs in your community for folks who either identify the need to change their behavior, or for folks whose partners are saying, you know what, I want to be in a relationship with you, but you need to change your behavior, and I need you to find some kind of program and help and support for you to make changes in your life. Let's see, let me advance us. Great. So at the same time, over the past years, past several decades, I should say, there's been an increased funding for victim services, a rise in pro-arrest policies, greater use of protection orders, in great part because of the Violence Against Women Act, which really created a funding stream and support for communities who are seeking to enhance their responses to domestic violence. Jim might talk a little bit later today about his experience as a probation officer handling these cases and what accountability means in those contexts. Maybe in your jurisdiction, you have a domestic violence court where one judge is hearing all the domestic violence cases, either on the criminal or the civil side, and they're doing some kind of post-disposition judicial monitoring, making sure someone's going to the program, getting compliance reports. And we'll talk about that and the role of that in accountability as well. There are several different program models, and we encourage you to think about and understand what's happening in your community. What types of what are the programs in your community for abusive partners? Are they educational? Psychoeducational is the most prominent and prevalent type of programming around the country, right? Where it's looking at this your thoughts, feelings, and belief, and giving you some kind of education, an educational component about why folks might use harm in their intimate partner relationships, what is abuse, what is abuse, those types of things. There are several culturally specific abusive partner intervention programs, and many of our consultants and experts on this project run exactly those programs, and we'll talk a little bit about them. An emerging practice is a more restorative justice focus. Some of you may have heard about Circles of Peace, which are running their restorative circles that are running for people who cause harm in their intimate partner violence relationship. And the center did a study, a survey of programs around the country who are using restorative practices in intimate partner violence. And if you're interested in that, you can certainly look at our website, and we'll give you the link for our website at the end of this presentation. some of the major goals, right, as Cheryl said at the beginning, right, we're not going to throw away recidivism. We want to stop this behavior, and one way of measuring it that's important for courts is this person getting arrested again, right? We want to reduce the violence. And as a court, we want to kind of increase those costs for non-compliance, and that's where those compliance calendaring can come in, and working closely with probation and the program to make sure that someone is going to a program if you are mandating it. Accountability, right? That's really thinking about, we want you to complete this program. We told you you needed to go. We want you to complete it. We don't want to hear too much about your change process. We just want to make sure that you go to that program, right? And we're going to use sanctions to make sure that you go. That often goes hand in hand with a desire to reduce recidivism. When we're thinking about this expanded definition of accountability, then that's where we want to start thinking about other things like, how can we influence the norms in our community around domestic violence? What can we do to think about someone being located within a culture and a community that may either support and condone violence, or alternately can support this person as they want to change behaviors and live a nonviolent life? And one of our partners, Men Stopping Violence in DeKalb, talks a lot about that in their program. One thing that we did when we were looking at programming in the Bronx was to think about, we did surveys with those victims and survivors whose partners or ex-partners had been arrested for domestic violence. And what was interesting there is whether or not the program worked, the victims really wanted the person who had hurt them, the person who had been arrested, to go to a program. They were more satisfied with the outcome of a case if there was some kind of program attached to that disposition. And I think that's really important, and Cheryl's going to talk a lot about centering the voices of survivors. But that's really important that we are educating victim advocates about what programs can and cannot do, so that they can really talk through and manage the expectations of a survivor around, this is what the curriculum of the program is. This is what is going to be happening while your partner or ex-partner is in this program, that kind of thing, because we want to make sure that we're hearing from survivors, number one, what they think the needs are, but also making sure that they understand what the program is and what the role of the program is within this larger context of accountability. So what's happening nationally? And this is where we are today. As Cheryl said, there's this movement towards a better understanding of risk, needs, responsivity, and we'll talk we're going to touch a little bit on that, but Cheryl and one of our other consultants did a wonderful podcast on comprehensive assessment that I encourage you to check out on our website. Jim and I did a great webinar on risk and risk assessments that's also on our website. There's more research on adverse childhood experiences and hope, and we're going to be talking about that. We're now living in a very interesting time for courts, for stakeholders, for all of us to really be thinking about what is the role of justice reform in really addressing more holistically the needs and desires of survivors, and are there ways that we can enhance our responses to abusive partners to create multiple pathways for them to change their behaviors and live lives, really of dignity and respect in every aspect, including with their intimate partners. We want to be thinking about those voices that weren't necessarily originally included in this definition of a top-down accountability. So centering those voices from the margin and making sure that we're creating programming that responds to their needs and to their strengths, and then really understanding how domestic violence is intertwined with so many other issues and concerns that you as court administrators may be addressing, whether it's substance abuse issues, whether it's mental health concerns. All those issues can be intertwined, and so it's important to really understand how they intersect. Great. So when we came together as consultants, and we're just so honored to have Jim and Cheryl on our team to think about these things, we decided, number one, that we wanted to expand that definition of accountability, as Cheryl said. And two, we wanted to come up with some guiding principles that would literally guide the work that we're doing, what kind of trainings we wanted to do, what kind of technical assistance, and a lot of that was based on what we had been hearing over the past several years working together. So when Jim and I would go out together to a jurisdiction, we'd be hearing what what survivors were talking about. We'd be listening in on programs and hearing what the challenges were to accountability that the men in the program were facing. We were talking to judges and court administrators about how do we even handle these cases effectively. And so we came up with these principles, and we're going to go through them right now, and we hope they'll be helpful to you all when you're thinking about, as court administrators, how can we address accountability, and what would it mean to implement and operationalize these guiding principles into our work. So the first one is that accountability is active and relational. And you'll see there in the corner, we develop these spheres of accountability, right? So when we're thinking about accountability, we know that, intimate partner violence doesn't only impact the victim survivor, but also the children in there, those immediate family members. It can impact extended family members, right? Because we know that isolation is often a part of domestic violence. And we know that it can impact those bigger spheres of the community as well, and all of our relationships. So when we're thinking about holding someone accountable, we want to think about, okay, if this person is an abusive partner, then how can they be accountable to all these different spheres, their intimate partner relationships, their family relationships, and their larger community relationships. And so, Jim, I know you've been talking and thinking about a lot of this for years, in particular, not only with your own experience growing up in a home where there was violence, but also as a probation officer and as a facilitator of, an abusive partner intervention program. So I'm going to be clicking on these things, these different partners that create this wall of accountability and support, and just wanted to give you time to talk about the ways when we're thinking beyond that individual accountability into our community.
Thank you, Rebecca. When we really look at the system's response to domestic violence, we want to look at how everybody was trained. How are we sending a consistent message to those who are harmed and those who are doing the damage? How do we share information so it's not lost? Well, we did know the research suggested that when somebody was killed, that when we went back and talked to all the community partners, there were people who knew that this person was extremely dangerous, but that information wasn't always shared. So we want to make sure that our 911 operators are trained to collect the right information, to know what type of assistance a person who's being harmed needs, what type of danger first responders might be going into the home. Police officers are trained to look for a predominant aggressor, to separate an alleged victim from an alleged perpetrator, to know the risk and medical needs of a victim who may have been strangled and yet has no physical signs of damage, and how do we address that person and make sure that they get these right needs. Our prosecutors are prosecuting cases well. If we arrest the right person and throw them in jail, but then the case disappears and are never held accountable past that, is that really what justice is, right? So how well is information given to a prosecutor that says, this guy's really dangerous? Did we collect that information? Did we share that information? Was the prosecutor able to share that information in a timely fashion to a judge who's making a decision on bail, and if a person should be released or not, and under what type of conditions. Should I have a tether attached to me? Should I be required to do drug testing? How does that impact my victim's safety, right? We also wanted to make sure that we were engaging with victim advocates to make sure, again, that our policies and procedures weren't actually harming those who we were trying to protect, and that we were sending the right message and not putting people in really bad predicaments. For us, probation and parole was the weak point, because if I liked an offender, I maybe didn't hold him accountable the same way I did an offender that I didn't like. And many of my domestic violence offenders were very charismatic and very polite and articulate and engaging with me. That doesn't mean that they weren't controlling and abusive and dangerous at home, right? And many victims may not participate with me, may not be overly willing to be engaged with a system who may have let them down and failed them before, and yet she deserved the same amount of protection, the same amount of compassion, the same amount of energy as a victim who is totally compliant and engaged in working with the system. Our judges, as I told you, I was very blessed. I had amazing judges who had extensive training and really respected the law, respected the rights of those who were accused, respected the safety and dignity of those who had been harmed, and really tried to make sure that I was collecting the right information from the 911 call to jail calls to inmate services to the prosecutor to batterers intervention, and sharing all of that information and presenting it to the judge so she could make the very best possible decision on how to impact this family in a way that would be helpful to them and to our community. And then we had to really work with our batterers intervention programs. Just because I say I'm a program doesn't mean I'm a program that does well, right? And so we wanted to go and watch the program, see what they were actually doing, have victim services go with us and watch with the eyes of a victim and say, okay, is what we're teaching and what we're doing helpful to people back home? And pulling this all together, then looking at all of our other partners in this. If we do it right, we're going to create a wall of accountability around an offender and a wall of support around those who which they harm. And we're also going to hold each other accountable. I need a judge to say, Jim, you can do more, right? I need to go push the batterers intervention programs. We can be better today than we were last year. And we're all kind of motivating each other to be the best that we could be.
Great. Thanks so much, Jim. I wanted to turn it over to Cheryl to have her talk a little bit more about your experience, in Colorado around this idea of system accountability as well, and how you in some ways bake that into your standards through having multidisciplinary teams and other types of things, and just wanted to offer that up to you, how we can move away from this idea of finger pointing, if only the police did their job, this would never happen, or those victim advocates and their confidentiality, they're ruining everything, or, those prosecutors, if only they prosecuted. I'm sure you came across that in Colorado as well when you were thinking about standards for domestic violence accountability programs.
Right. And, I want to supplement what Jim was talking about. He's talking about a lot of collaboration, a lot of communication. And, if we take that, and that might seem, for those of you that are watching our workshop, you might think, wow, that's kind of overwhelming. How do you do that? Maybe that's ideal. I don't know if we could do that here. We already have a hard time with some of us talking to each other. And in Colorado, what we've learned, and I know that Jim has experienced this as well, if we back that up just a little bit and say, one of the things that we can do for our system is to set up a task force where we have representation from the prosecutor's office, hopefully representation of judges and probation and victim services and the intervention provider and so forth, and have them start having some initial conversations with each other about how, we all want the same end result. We want the abusive person to stop that behavior. We want victims to be safe. We want our community to be safe. We want law enforcement to be safe, etc. And one of the things that I'm sure that Jim experienced, and we have experienced in Colorado, and certainly other states as well, is that you can set up a task force where you get this representation, and you're not coming together as a group to talk about specific cases necessarily, but what you are doing is learning from each other about what each one's roles are and how does that work. The prosecutor is educating the treatment providers and so forth, and that is really, really helpful. And we've had a number of areas of Colorado that when they have done that, they have had huge success in better containment of offenders and improved victim safety, which I think is what Jim is referring to. So kind of store that little nugget away. It could be work at the outset to set up a task force. You may be thinking, oh my gosh, we don't have time to do that. We already have too many meetings to go to. But everybody that I've worked with that has done it has said it actually saves us all time and it makes us all more efficient. The other thing that we've done in Colorado is we have made team decision making mandatory in our offender intervention programming. So probation and the treatment provider have to be communicating. We also require victim advocate to be a part of that team. The advocate does not reveal specific information from a victim. That is not the goal. It's not to place victims in more danger or more harm, but to keep reminding the team to think about general victim perspective and how this could impact a victim. And then again, within that MTT, they are educating each other about their role in the system. And before we had this, what we found was that the treatment providers had unrealistic expectations of probation, thinking they should be able to do something they can't even do. Probation didn't really understand exactly what was going on in treatment and in the intervention. And so educating each other really helps hold the system accountable. And I think Jim touched on a lot of important points there. And then, Rebecca, did you want me to talk about this next slide too, about survivor voices are centered?
Yes, definitely. So our next principle, once we talked about active and relational accountability, is obviously the importance of centering survivor voices. And so, Cheryl, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that and what that might mean.
Again, I think it's so important that we have victim advocates that are always a part of the process to keep reminding each of us at each step along the way, and regardless of what our role is in this whole process of ending the abuse, to what the victim advocate can really do is help keep reminding us all, but what about the survivor? What about the victim in this case? And that can sound like that's difficult to do, but with training from the victim advocates and training from victim services, we can learn so much. One of the things I think about when I'm thinking about the audience that we're talking to today, and court administrators, folks that are working in that part of the system, if you ever have interaction with victims, you may be experiencing that they may kind of be all over the place. They may be upset. They may be angry. They may be scared. They may say one thing and then they say, no, I never said that. And what can really help is working with victim services to get trainings to better understand where victims are coming from, why might they say that, and having, as I said, having an aspect of someone who can be a part of the process to keep reminding us not only to think about the victim safety in every decision that we're making. And Jim gave some good examples of that in some cases where had the victim gone forward with a restraining or a protective order, that would have made things much more dangerous for her. Had she gone through a criminal process, it could have been much, much more difficult for her. So if we can't speak to the specific victim in each case, at least having advocates and others who can help us understand what that might be like for them.
Great. Thanks so much. So our third principle is around hope and dignity, that we really want hope and dignity to be restored for that survivor and also for the person who's caused harm. We want to make sure that they're creating spaces for change and safety, that they're treating that abusive partner with dignity and respect, modeling that behavior, and also helping create pathways for them to develop lives that can be led with dignity and respect, that they can create goals for healthy and violent-free relationships. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail when we're talking about assessing for hope. And Jim, you want to just talk, as you know, people can see the research up here. I think it's really interesting, the connection between the lack of hope for the future and intimate partner violence, and maybe some ways that you've taken this research and applied it to the program that you're running in Michigan.
So it makes perfect sense, you know, that people who have low hope are going to have more depression, more likely to be drinking, more likely to commit suicide, all these things. And when we're looking at domestic violence, many times when men commit suicide, we take out our partners with us. Sometimes we intend to kill ourselves. We kill our partner and then we chicken out on killing ourselves. So we want to start to address this. Then the research has been supporting this, right? Out of Baltimore, they found the #1 contributor was a lack of hope. Out of Pittsburgh and some other programs around the country, at least anecdotally, we found when we've addressed lack of hope and we've magnified that and looked at resiliency, we've actually found better success rates, higher completion rates. One of the things that our program started to do now, and we're even going to change our name, our program is called Accountable Choices, and we're going to move to Men of Integrity. And one of the things that we're going to do when a person comes in is have them kind of travel to the future and describe what an ideal man of integrity would look like. What would that look like as a partner? What would that look like as a father? What would that look like as a community member? Right? All the characteristics, the behaviors, the things that would happen. How does it feel to experience that? What would people say around you? How would you feel? And really live there for a minute. Then come back to the present and kind of prepare for the journey, right? So now that I know where I want to be, and I know what I would like to hear my son say about me, what I'd like to hear my daughter say about me, what I'd like to hear the community say about me, how I would like to feel about me, how do I get there? And what are my pathways there? When we start talking about hope, there's a difference between hope and a wish, right? So Chan Hellman, a researcher in the area of hope, talks about if I say, I hope it's a sunny day today, that's really a wish because I have no power over if it's going to be sunny or raining. Or I hope you have a nice day today, Rebecca, right? I have no power over that. I'm not going to hang out with you today other than having this conference. This may be the end of our conversation and so many other things. So in order for there to be hope, there has to be a goal, something that I believe that's achievable and realistic, right? Not a goal that's outside of my parameter. I have to have a way to achieve that goal, right? I have the ability, and then I have to have the willpower to actually achieve that out. The problem is, oftentimes we have goals, but we either don't know how to get there or we don't know how to overcome the roadblocks in front of us. And there's some research actually out there that talks about when they've spent time with people, had them identify their goals, identify the pathways to get there, identify the roadblocks, and come up with 3 alternatives or ways to address that roadblock, that we dramatically increase the hope, even beyond the score of our treatment intervention programs. And they've been doing this in camps with kids who experience violence and trauma. They're starting to do this area. Viger is actually a victim risk assessment for victims that looks at building hope in victims too. Because if there's no hope for me as a victim, I'm going to stay in a dangerous situation because what's the point, right? And so we have to really start working with families and finding ways that we can do that.
Right. And I think when we're talking about hope, it's also important for programs and for all of those partners to really understand the role of culture and community and helping to build those supports to help hold that person accountable with that willpower and that way power. And so one of the principles that we created was to really to center culture and community, right? That they're reflected in the programming and that they're valued in the programming. And many of our consultant partners have been working really hard on this. So, you know, we want to have that really true collaboration to really think about creating safe and healthy relationships. And we want to understand that those pathways to change can reflect the diversity of the community, that the facilitators are reflective of the participants in the group, and that that those people in group can really bring in those values that are going to help support them and unpack some of those values and norms from their community that may be holding them back from achieving those goals of having healthy and safe relationships in the future. When we're talking about intersectionality, as I said before, there's a lot of other things going on. You know, human beings are not one-dimensional. We have a lot of things going on at the same time for ourselves. So there's emerging research on the importance of understanding adverse childhood experiences. And we'll talk a little bit about that research, but they've since expanded that to really think about the conditions in our communities that are tied to systemic oppression and how those impact folks, the people in groups, to really be able to understand their goals, to think about and find ways and pathways to achieve those goals. We know that systemic oppression and social location affect how people show up in the world, right? And how they're going to show up in a program. And we want to make sure that we're validating those experiences, right? We're not using them as an excuse, but we want to really understand how systemic oppression also is tied to violence against women or violence in intimate partner relationships, and how those things really need to be unpacked together in a group and not kind of dismissed. So I think we've been finding that's important, and many of our partners around the country are doing that in amazing ways. I'll let Jim talk about his program at Accountable Choices, but I'll first talk about, you know, one of our partners, Caminar Latino, has a curriculum for Latino men designed by a Latino psychologist. The facilitators are chosen really based on their relatability and their fluency. They need to be fluent in Spanish. This is not an opportunity to be practicing your Spanish. They really want groups to be able to be bilingual. Men Stopping Violence has exercises on that intersectionality. They have an African American culturally specific group for men, and they bring, part of their program requires that the men bring in a peer from their community into group with them, which is a really powerful experience. And then Wicca Agli in Minnesota incorporates traditional Native teachings into the curriculum, host cultural camps for team building, and really draws on the strengths of their particular Native traditions to help build their curriculum and build and support those men in the processes of change. But Jim, do you want to talk about how you've kind of incorporated the culture of your participants into your curriculum?
Well, there's a variety of ways. You know, one of the things is we try to talk to the community and figure out who's serving that community. If we have marginalized groups, right? So I work in Detroit. We have a large African American community. We have a large Arabic community. We have some LGBTQ community. So really kind of talking about what services are available for those individuals, having handouts that address their specific issues and needs. Being able to talk about religion and faith and pulling that into the program. So when we're really talking about culture, for me, I have a lot of clients who are bilingual. A lot of clients that English is not their primary language, but was not their first language. So how are we addressing that? How are we able to talk? We have, my guys are required to call someone every week. And then when they're going to present an assignment, 2 people have to approve that assignment. So we may hook you up with a mentor who speaks your language, understands your culture, is from your faith. Clients who don't have any resources at all who are coming to our program, they may be able to pay for treatment by tutoring other clients. So we're engaging. So if I'm some of my men, I may have only completed the 3rd grade. I don't read and write, even though I was born here in this country, right? So, and I have a learning disability. So having that ability for one-on-one work with other guys, it actually helps the guy who's doing the mentoring because he's having to relearn this and do this better, and it helps that client who's experiencing that.
Great, thanks so much. And then finally, we have a guiding principle that states that intervention engagement strategies respond to the needs and strengths of abusive partners. And I think that's kind of summarizing a lot of the things that we've been talking about in the last part of this presentation, that we know that we want to understand the importance of risk needs responsivity, but we also want to bring in and understand this intersectionality and where past traumas may impact someone's ability to engage in programming, to participate in programming, that may impact their ability to see them as someone who can actually change their own future. And so thinking about and helping them identify their strengths. And so we'll talk a little bit about the ways that we are doing that through risk needs responsivity. And I know we're running a little bit short on time, but Cheryl, I didn't know if you wanted to just talk about how Colorado took this research around risk needs responsivity and incorporated it into the programming and the standards.
Right, and Colorado has incorporated risk needs responsivity into our treatment standards. One of the things that we did was determine that we had to have a really good way to assess for risk and to put offenders in treatment based on their risk, and that we don't want to have high-risk offenders with low-risk offenders, and intensity of treatment needs to match their risk so that we get better outcomes. So we created the Domestic Violence Risk and Needs Assessment Instrument, and that really helps us do that at the beginning of treatment to get them into the appropriate intensity of treatment based on their risk, but we can also use those risk factors to identify during treatment if risk is being mitigated or if risk is going up, because there are a lot of dynamic risk factors on that instrument.
Great. Thanks so much. And if folks want to learn more about that, as I said, you can listen to the, we have a webinar recording with Cheryl talking a little bit more in detail about that. So then we mentioned the adverse childhood experiences, and you can see them here. I'm assuming many of you are familiar with them. And then we added on there the expanded ACEs that talk about those community experiences that might impact things. And Jim, do you want to just quickly talk about how you've included ACEs into your programming?
Yes, the interesting thing that we're talking about is accountability, right? So in the beginning, a lot of people were worried about us talking about trauma and thought that allowed men to avoid responsibility. What we found out is that our men had experienced huge amounts of ACEs, right? Many of them came from impoverished homes. They witnessed domestic violence. They may have had a parent with mental health or substance abuse problems, incarceration. But also, the men we're working with have given their children and their families humongous ACEs. So what we did is we brought in the ACE test. We have the men do that in class, and then they talk about it. And I've had men who score a 10. They witnessed their dad commit suicide. There's drinking and drugging in their family. There was domestic violence with other men that came into the family. And so when men talked about having a 7, having an 8, having a 10, it was really empowering, really impactful to the men in group. The next week they come in, and I have the ACEs scores back out again. And people are like, we already did this, Mr. Henderson. And we're like, no, we're not doing this for ourselves this week. We're doing it for our children. And that was really interesting because some men, let's say I only had an ACE score of 3, but I listened to some of my colleagues, some of my peers who shared an impact of having a 7. And it was so empowering. I mean, it was so impactful, right? Hear someone share raw feelings and still be affected by something 30 years later and seeing how this impacts their relationship with their wife and their own children. And now when I take my son's ACE score, I looked and I gave my son a 7. And that almost had more impact on my men than their own scores. And then we were able to start talking about, remember, building hope. Because I'm not trying to impound shame. I'm trying to say, let's look at what we've done, men. Let's look at what's done to us. Let's unpack that, talk about that, share that. But then let's look at how we pass that pain on to other people. Another colleague of ours, Steve Haley, talks about this river of cruelty, right? That we just keep passing this on. And we want to stop that cycle. And so for the men, then we start looking at resiliency and hope, and we make a plan. So again, this is ideally. So how do I repair that with my son? What our retributions would be? You know, what are some protective measures that I could enhance or be a part of or encourage? And I think that's a really positive way, because I don't want to be counseling the children of the men I'm working with today, right? We want them to stay out of our system and to have happy lives. And we think that if we do a good job with the men that we have in our programs today, we should see a far smaller percentage of their kids experiencing the same type of pain that they do.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Jim. That's such an important point. So we want to just take it home for you all now and have Jim and Cheryl just, talk about any of these strategies. When Jim, Cheryl, and I have gone to different parts of the country and talked with folks and helped communities think about abusive partner intervention and engagement. And here are some things that we found to be helpful. We've talked a lot about the collaboration. I think understanding how the system works, understanding who the programs are and what the victim advocates are, really thinking about, is there a way to create these multiple pathways for accountability, not only our criminal and our civil system, but as well as community-based. That all involves planning. And one thing I know about court administrators and court managers is you're excellent planners. You enjoy the process of planning. We need that, right, to make our courts run smoothly. And so really thinking about strategic planning, and we have a lot of tools available to you to identify the strengths in your community, where there are challenges and opportunities, how these cases are coming in, and who's getting programming and who needs programming. Those are all really important pieces to understand, really how you could implement and operationalize these principles in your court responses and in your community. Then I don't know, Jim or Cheryl, if you have anything that you wanted to add.
I'll talk a little bit about, Rebecca, you and I have gone to some communities where we went in there, we watched the judicial review, watched what the court said. We met with the victim advocates, talked about what they thought the system was doing well, where they thought the system was not doing as well. And then we actually met with all the batterers intervention programs. And what we did, we had them all come in and present. And they presented to the probation department, I think some judges, some prosecutors, I think there's some child custody evaluators. So a whole bunch of people from the community came and watched. And each program talked about their program, their model, who their ideal client was, why they chose that model, right? How they felt that model enhanced victim safety, how they felt that model contributed to offender behavior change. Because there's different programs that could be designed. The nice thing about what Cheryl's done, forever, we've all talked about we needed different models, we needed to be responsive to risk and needs. But instead of talking about it, they actually implemented it, right? They said, all right, let's look at what the research says will help this guy best at this level. What's the research say on this? And then we went around and actually went and watched the programs. And not always what people say about their programs in a meeting is what people do in their programs. So it was really interesting for us to go and watch and then have that discussion. And think about this. I have an Apple Watch, not on right now, but it's normally I have an Apple Watch. Each year, that watch gets better because they're in competition with other watches, right? And we know what other watches are doing. We want our batterers intervention programs always learning from one another and becoming better every year too. Just like my iPhone, just like my Samsung. And so by bringing them in, talking about the strengths of the programs, the benefits, really, I think, help motivate that.
Yeah. Yeah, Cheryl, any closing words on your end?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think Jim covered it really well.
Great. Well, we thank you all for your participation today. We wanted to just leave you with, you know, some resources for you. We're certainly here as part of this grant project to support you, so you can reach out to us either through the email on here. You'll see it's dvaccountability@courtinnovation.org. Certainly send us an email and we can connect you with Jim and Cheryl and some of our other technical assistance experts. And we also have a great list of resources, including more details on our guiding principles. We have podcasts, webinars, research, you name it. We've got it on there at thecourtinnovation.org /abusive partner resources. So we hope to hear from you. We hope you're all doing well in times of COVID and moving forward and managing all of the stressors that the courts are under. We appreciate you and we look forward to potentially working with you in the future. Take care, everybody.